Welcome to Learning for Everyone, Accessibility and 508 Compliance. I know it's probably not the most exciting title ever, but hopefully you'll find something useful today. If you're any sort of educator doing basically anything online, I'll have some practical tips for you as we go through the presentation. And then afterwards, I've got a resource page with a practice exercise and more resources for you as well. So thank you so much for taking time to join me today. I know it is the observation of July 4th today. I'm not going anywhere, and I guess right now you're not going anywhere either. So we're all here together to learn about accessibility. So let's go ahead and dive in. So here's what we'll cover today. A definition of what accessibility and 508 compliance is. I think a lot of the time you hear the phrase 508 compliance, but it's not really clear exactly what that means. It's kind of just one of those nebulous things in the ether. We'll talk about creating accessible online content, and we'll talk about how to analyze accessibility of online content, because there's nothing worse than saying, all right, I need to make this accessible, but I don't know if I've actually been successful or not in making something accessible. All right, I'm obligated to pause for a moment and thank our sponsors as part of the MSIDT Summer Webinar Series. So thank you so much to Cal State Fullerton's MS and Certificate in Instructional Design and Technology program for making this possible. A little bit about the program. This is a program at Cal State Fullerton. Actually has two sub-programs, a Master of Science as well as a certificate. It's been completely online since 2002, so we know how to do online, right? There's been no rush to put these things online. And they have tons more information online at ed.fullerton.edu/MSIDT. If you want to hang around after the webinar, I'll stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions about the program. Otherwise, that's basically it for a word from our sponsor. Let's go ahead and move on. Okay, make sure I got all my items here. Okay, so we'll start with the importance of accessibility. Now, out of 1, 2, 3, 4 average people, one person has a disability. So out of every 4 people you meet, one of them is likely to have a disability, and that's according to statistics from the CDC. There are a number of different kinds of disabilities: vision, movement, thinking, so on and so forth. This is also a list from the CDC. The tips I give today aren't necessarily going to address all of these, and obviously I'm not going to be able to address how to make things accessible as really comprehensively as I would like, but we'll give you some tips to get started and some resources to investigate further if you'd like to go further with your accessibility education. So there's a lot of different ways that someone might have a disability that can affect the way they experience education or online content. And I thought it was really interesting that CDC also points out that there's 3 dimensions to having a disability. The first is an impairment, second is activity limitation, and the third is participation restriction. So basically, these are the 3 ways that a disability can have a major impact on your life. It might not be physical, it could be mental, you could have injury to your brain that's caused a disability, you can be limited as far as activities, and you can also be limited as far as participation as well. Whereas something like the internet can sometimes serve as an equalizer in helping everyone get better access to resources and to more resources. It can be kind of a double-edged sword, because a lot of the time those resources aren't actually accessible and are off the table basically for someone with a disability that isn't able to use something that is not accessible. So let's pause for a moment. Go ahead and locate the raise hand button on your screen. Zoom has a feature where you can raise your hand. Go ahead and raise your hand if you have ever enlarged text on a website. If you ever enlarged text on a website, go ahead and raise your hand. And I can actually see in the participants panel, yes, several of you have enlarged text on a website. I do it all the time, especially on my phone, because websites are often optimized for desktop. Raise your hand if you've ever turned on closed captions on a video. Go ahead and raise your hands. By the way, you can put your hands down in between, but I can see it's got some hands raised here. I got two screens going at the same time here, so that's why I'm looking off to the side here. Yes, I use closed captions all the time. If I need to be quiet for whatever reason, I got a baby sleeping, I might use closed captions. If I'm someplace really noisy, I might use closed captions. I find them to be very, very helpful. All right, last but not least, raise your hand if you've ever used dictation to type or text. Have you ever used dictation to type or text? Really, yes. I use dictation all the time because the keyboard on my device is really small, and sometimes you've only got one hand free. There's a lot of reasons you might use dictation to type out on your phone, or you might use it to type out on your computer as well. Sometimes if I'm just not feeling like typing out something really long, I'll start with kind of a train of thought, stream of consciousness, and just dictate that to my computer and then clean it up after the fact. Well, these are all assistive technology tools. If you've ever used any of those features, you've used an assistive technology. And accessible design, like accessibility features, it does make the experience better for everyone. If you don't have a disability, you might find a lot of these features really helpful. And if it's not a specific assistive technology, even the way that a website is designed can make the experience better for you. For example, if you enlarge a website, if the text doesn't reflow to still fit your screen, then it's not really as useful, right? So there's always some parameters in the back end that can affect how the content will actually work or reflow depending on if someone's using the assistive technology. So it's kind of two different dimensions to accessibility. It's programming things in the back end to make it work with assistive technology, and then the other kind of upfront features to make it work better with assistive technology. So let's look quickly at what inaccessibility looks like. Now, a lot of the time, if you are a fully sighted user and you have full use of your mouse or your finger if you're scrolling on your phone, it might be that a website looks perfectly accessible. This is an example that I pulled from Simple English Wikipedia. This is you can see that's dummy text I have on the paragraphs here. But I pulled the headings from an entry that Wikipedia has on flowers. Now, if you're fully sighted, you're able to kind of scan through and look at the heading and then look at the subheadings, right? So you can see kind of what headings you want to look at. You can see if you maybe want to read this full section, or maybe you want to go on and read the other section. But a lot of the time when we're approaching websites, we want to look at the headings, kind of see how the content's broken up. We're not going to start by reading word by word, right, from the very beginning. We like to scan and kind of see what we're interested in and then go straight to what we want, right? We're not going to read things that aren't of interest to us. And within each section as well, there might be little subheadings that can help you decide what you want to read. Now, if you're someone using a screen reader device, for instance, or using a keyboard, if that website is not programmed on the back end to be accessible, this is basically what you're faced with. Technically, the headings are still in there somewhere, but you basically have a wall of text and you have to go through word by word to find what you want. As you can imagine, this can be really frustrating if you're someone that's using an assistive technology. And again, that could be a screen reader. It could also be that they're not able to use a mouse, so they're using a keyboard. So they want to use a keyboard to scan through subheadings, but if it's not set up to work with those assistive technologies, even the keyboard navigation, you're going to end up with a kind of a wall of text situation. So it can look like it's very well set up if you're a sighted user. If you're not a sighted user, if you're using a technology to access it, the story can actually be very different. Now, the difference here with this example I have is the difference between font formattings and headings. So for example, if you're in Microsoft Word, I assume that you're all pretty familiar with Word. There's the section off to the left of Word that has the font choices, right? You can bold, italic, underline, you can change the color, you can change the size, you can make it bigger or smaller. But if you're using the font formatting only, then you're actually not making your document accessible. You're only making it look nice for someone that's fully sighted and has full use of keyboard or of their mouse. In contrast, Word has this really wonderful and often overlooked feature called styles in a circle right there, where you can format your text using headings and other very specific format options. And if you use these, you will make your document accessible. And you can actually save yourself a lot of time in the back end by using styles, because you can format all of the same kind of text at once rather than having to go back and address each item of text. I dropped that down here so you can see the further items here. So headings would be the things like, your main headings in a Wikipedia article. You would have the subheadings down below. That'd be heading 2. It's a little bit smaller. And you can see some of the other items here that you can use to format your text to actually program your content in the back end to make it more accessible for users. I'm a big fan of Microsoft styles. That's what the little heading options I just showed you. I use them all the time. Even if I'm not making a document that's for someone that has a disability, I like to program all of my stuff to be accessible from the very beginning, so it's more useful to everyone. And headings are the first place you can start on your road to making things accessible. If you're familiar at all with HTML programming, this is H1. That's a little bit of HTML code you would use in the back end. But if you're using Microsoft Word and you select heading 1, heading 2, or any of the other ones, you are basically programming your document in the back end to be accessible. So if you use headings, you're actually designating a block of text as a heading. It's going to appear as a heading to those users using a keyboard or a screen reader, and they're going to be able to scan through the content as well. So it takes something like this wall of text that is not accessible if you're using a keyboard or a screen reader, and it turns it into a very similar experience for someone that is sighted and using a mouse. So that's always the goal we have, is to create an experience that is equivalent no matter who you are, no matter what your disability is. All right, so go ahead and pause there for a moment. If you have any questions, please pop those into the chat box. I know I tend to kind of talk fast. Thank you, Clarissa, for that comment. I'm sorry that link wasn't working. I'll have to see what's going on. Okay, so as you have questions, please go ahead and pop them into the chat box, and I'll make sure I'll get those answered. For those that joined late, I've got the webinar locked down so that your comments are only viewable by me, your host, and no one else will be able to see them. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk about accessibility and the law. In general, if you work in corporate or private organization, legally, you're probably not required to make your content accessible. Whether or not, you actually have employees with disabilities. I mean, it might be that the employee with disability has to ask for accommodations for you to make it accessible. It'd be nice if you made all those things accessible, but legally, you're probably not required. However, if you work for the government, or if your workplace is publicly funded in any sort of aspect, you probably are required to make your content accessible. Of course, my caveat with that is that I am not a lawyer. Please check with your own leadership if you have accessibility requirements in your organization. And of course, this is not to say that making things accessible is not best design practice. It's always best design practice to make your content as usable as possible for everyone. But I did want to point out the law here. All right, and when it comes to the law, that's where Section 508 comes in. Section 508 is a piece of federal law that has been adopted by most states as the standard for accessibility. A little bit of history for what Section 508 is. In 1998, it was born with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973's amendment. As of 1998, federal agencies were just now required to make their electronic and IT accessible to people with disabilities. And this is really recent history. I mean, the internet's been around for a long time, and computers have been around even longer before that. So it's disappointing that it took so long to require content to be accessible. Significantly, this section was revised in 2017, and now most states refer to this section of US Code as their accessibility requirement. So it lays out how accessible, what standard your content needs to be to meet Section 508. So most states obviously find it easier just to point to that standard as it's updated, not create their own standard. Now here's what this section actually requires. I'm not going to go too deep into the weeds and all this, but I want to give you some context for why we make things accessible and how we make things accessible and what standard they need to be made accessible. All right, so the law requires that they are made accessible to the standard outlined by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, 2.0 level AA. I know that is super exciting and memorable, but I list this so you can go back and you can always look this up and see what the standard is. This is developed by an organization called W3C. They set the standards for the World Wide Web, and as such, they're excellently positioned to set the standards for accessibility as well. So they have a lot of different levels that you can meet as far as accessibility goes, but the law, if you're following Section 508, requires 2.0 level AA. All right, so let's pretty quickly run over what this means. So WCAG 2.0 requires your content to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And just like we looked at the list of possible kinds of disabilities and what the dimensions of those disabilities are and how they affect a person's life, this might make a little bit more sense. So things need to be perceivable. That means people need to be able to kind of see what's going on. It needs to be operable. That means they need to be able to use it with a keyboard, with their voice, with a mouse, whatever. It needs to be understandable. And I think this is really significant for, especially if you have like a cognitive disability. You'll notice earlier my example was actually from the Simple English Wikipedia. That's actually an alternate Wikipedia site that has entries that are written out to be more simple using simpler, lower level English. That can be really helpful for someone with a cognitive disability, for instance. And your sites also need to be robust. That means they need to have all the features required to make things fully accessible and usable. And another thought, and it's gone. Basically fully featured. They need to have fallbacks. That's what I was going for, fallbacks as well, in case someone gets stuck on a site. So again, really quickly, let's talk about what each of these things mean. Perceivable means things like text alternatives for non-text content. So if you have an image, someone that's blind would be able to see that image. There needs to be a description for that image. Content needs to be presented in different ways. So just like we talked about being able to maybe enlarge content on your phone screen so that it kind of reshapes the content to fit your phone screen, that's a good example of content that can be presented in a different way. We want to make it easier for users to see and hear content. So that might also be having controls available, using the technology of their choice potentially to display your content. Operable means you need to be able to use a keyboard to access all of your content. I think number 2.2 is important here. Give your users enough time to read and use content. Sometimes you might have an online tutorial where the slides on the tutorial are timed and you don't have enough time to actually read all the content on a slide. That's making a slide inaccessible. They need to have control or at least enough time to read the content. Don't design content in ways known to cause seizures, like flashing lights, for instance, or any sort of flashing that can happen on a screen. And I like this one because this is especially useful for everyone. Provide ways to help users navigate, find content, and determine where they are. You'll see that a lot of time in websites that have breadcrumbs. So the further you go into like a website's menu, you might see the breadcrumbs appear across the top of your screen that always let you go up one level to the next level on the website, for example. All right, understandable. Again, makes text content readable and understandable. That might mean using simpler English or really making sure the language you use is tailored to your given audience. Make web pages appear and operate in predictable ways. We all use the web on a daily basis, I assume, unless we're on some sort of retreat from technology. So there tends to be standards and expectations that users have for how things should operate. Make note of common practices, use those same practices yourself, and also help users avoid and correct mistakes. And that can be by designing things to make sure buttons are far enough apart that someone's not going to click the wrong one accidentally. Maybe things are really well labeled. And again, things like breadcrumbs where users can kind of figure out where they are and go back if they went to the wrong place in a given website. All right, lastly, robust. Robust just means that your content should work with current and future assistive technologies. As a designer that is not a programmer, this isn't really something that you have to worry about, except as far as you choose a platform for your content that works with assistive technologies. And Any major learning management system, for example, these days will work with assistive technologies. If you use the Microsoft suite, those items will work with assistive technologies, both the programs themselves and anything you make with the programs. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're selecting a platform to make sure that platform itself is accessible. Okay, so I've gone through a bunch of stuff pretty quickly here. In the chat box, if you'd please maybe just pop in an online format that you are working with, either a website, Office document, tutorials, something else. I'd love to see what some of your projects are that you are concerned about making accessible. I'll pause for a moment while you do that. Oh, okay, so this person's interested in creating GIFs of common tasks. That's a really cool idea. So if you wanted to create like a GIF, okay, how to access your ILL pages. So if you wanted to create a GIF of how to do a common task, so you're kind of like recording how to do a task, right, over a screen recording, and then you're turning it into a GIF. That's really cool, and that's a good idea for yeah, definitely sighted users. You just have to basically type out instructions below that would be equivalent to whatever's in the GIF. All right, so I'm using Word or Google G Suite. Google's improved their accessibility features for sure, so there's a lot more accessible in Google these days than there used to be. Let me scroll down here. Someone's been trying to make an online tutorial, but instructions and pages and steps and follow-up quizzes. Okay. Yeah, so you make an online tutorial. A lot of the time, I won't be able to go into depth in this, obviously, today. But if you make an online tutorial where the user has to kind of view content and then there's like next and previous buttons, you would have to set up the order in which the keyboard will access each of those things. So for example, just like if you're sighted and you read on this slide, chat first, and then you read this stuff, and then you go to the picture, you'd want to make sure if someone is using a keyboard that those things are read in the same order. So if you're using a software like Storyline or Captivate, there's a feature in which you specify, I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, my mind is gone these days, but you specify keyboard order to make sure that someone using keyboard goes through in the same order. All right, what else are you all working on? Let's see here. All right, doing a website. Okay, good. I got some tips for websites here. And let's see, you're working on short videos with transcripts. Yep. Tutorials, courses. Yeah, I've got a lot of items there. So I've got some general guidelines I'll cover for accessibility, and we can always talk more about your individual items at the end of today's webinar. Someone else is using VoiceThread. That can be tricky to make accessible. Depending on your subscription level to VoiceThread, it can auto-generate captions. I don't know if the Cal State Fullerton one does or not. Susan, those other two, Panopto and Nomia, I'm not as familiar with as far as accessibility, but we can always talk more about it later too. All right, thanks for sharing what you're working on. I really appreciate that. So I'm gonna share some general guidelines for making items accessible and also go into a few specific formats as well. And I'd love to talk more about your own projects and what you all have going on, your specific questions. Okay, so let's talk about how to create accessible online content. Again, our time is limited and I can't go through everything that I would love to go through, but I'll give you some general guidelines, some guidelines for specific formats, and then I will show you a tool to analyze accessibility of web content. And of course, I do have some resources to share with you at this end of this presentation as well. Okay, so let's start with general guidelines. And these are guidelines that are applicable for basically whatever platform you are using. All right, and in the corner here, I've got a little marker indicating which facet of the WCAG guidelines that we are adhering to. So alt text for images. In general, if you're using an image, you need to have an equivalent experience for someone that cannot view or experience that image, and you can do that by adding alt text. Now, if you have something really long or complex, like an infographic, you should type out all that text below. Okay. And alt text, if you're doing alt text for an image, it should be really short and sweet, only 100 characters or less. If it needs to be more than 100 characters, then you might probably just put a note in the alt text saying it's going to be typed out below, and then type it out below. Okay, it's kind of like a text message, short and sweet. If an image you're using is decorative, just don't add alt text, because if someone's using a screen reader, they're not going to care if you have a decorative image. If you add alt text, the screen reader will read it to them. So if you leave it blank, it'll just skim over it. All right, contrast. Contrast is really important as far as making text readable, as far as making any sort of content readable. If you have something someone needs to experience on a background, you need to make sure there's sufficient contrast between the two things. And of course, there is a ratio spelled out. It's a 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio. I'll show you a tool for figuring out if you're at that ratio or not. But what I found interesting was that there's this ad for Amazon Music, and there's this white text on this blue background, and that's actually insufficient contrast. As a sighted person with pretty good vision, it looks fine to me, but someone else that has less good vision or some other issues going on, that actually is insufficient contrast, and they might not be able to experience it. So something that might look okay to you may not actually be okay. So there are tools out there so you can make sure that your text and your background are actually going to have sufficient contrast. Okay, let's move on. In general, avoid using click here. If you hyperlink a statement like click here, screen readers are going to have no idea where those go. Basically, if you use a screen reader, I've got some examples in my list of resources here, that screen reader is going to read aloud the links to the person so they know whether or not they want to use that link. And if a link just reads aloud as click here, it's kind of like saying, do I want to jump off this cliff? I don't know where this goes. I have no idea if this is going to be useful for me or not. So instead, hyperlink a descriptive statement, like sign up for an account, latest report, things like that. So no matter what kind of web content you're doing, whether it's a course, whether it's an email, or you have some sort of flyer, avoid click here, use a descriptive statement. And I also encourage you to avoid pasting in links, because a screen reader will read every character of a link out loud. And imagine being held hostage in an experience where your screen reader is going through the text and then it starts rambling https://medium.com, and actually it'll spell out the letters for that, and it'll spell out the whole thing, and you have to sit there and listen to the whole thing. And again, you're probably not going to have much an idea of where that goes, and you're just going to irritate your user. So avoid pasting in links as well. Finally, only links should be underlined. It is a common feature on the web that if something's underlined, it is a hyperlink. So if you are creating content that's going to be displayed on the web or used by someone on their computer, only underline links. Anything else, you can bold it, you can italicize it, but use something else to differentiate it other than an underline, because only links should be underlined. All right, so let's dive into a few more specific guidelines, like say for video. It's probably obvious, but closed captions need to be added to all videos. So my strategy and what I suggest to you is to use YouTube. You can upload a video as private, and then you can correct the auto captions. So anything you upload to YouTube, within a few minutes, it'll automatically generate captions, but those captions it automatically generates are not up to the required level by law of accuracy. They need to be more accurate. So I go in there and I automatically, or I create the, I can't speak today. I correct the automatically created captions. Additionally, if you used a transcript to create a video, so you read a script while recording a video and that's a video you upload, you can upload that video and your transcript, and YouTube will just sync your transcript to your video automatically, and it'll create perfect captions and you won't have to do anything further. And also wonderfully, if you do have a captioned video, it automatically will have a transcript created as well. So that's a really nice feature for your users to have closed captions as well as a transcript. So I also recommend creating transcripts if you can, because sometimes it's nice for someone to be able to read in one place a whole document outlining what's said in the video. Now this one might not seem obvious, especially if you're creating a tutorial, but in general, you should avoid auto-playing media. Your user instead should be allowed to control whether something plays. They should be able to pause it, fast forward, go back, all those good things. And the reason for this is that screen reader users navigate by sound as they go through everything using their keyboard on a website. It's kind of telling them where they're going, what they're using. So if they navigate by sound and a video starts automatically playing, obviously the sound is turned on their computer. That's going to be really disruptive to their experience. So give them control over the video. Additionally, animations can be a problem for people with certain types of learning disabilities. So if you have some animation that automatically comes across the screen, maybe do some research on what kind of animations are good and less good for people with learning disabilities. I like to say, in general, when in doubt, fade in and out and kind of avoid the really excessive flourishy animations. Let's talk a little bit about documents and web content. So this might be if you are creating a Microsoft Word document, or if you are creating something in an online course, or maybe a web page. All right, so we already talked about format your documents with headings. Whether you're using Microsoft Word or if you're using an online web editor, any self-respecting web editor is going to have the option to format your text using headings, okay? When you use headings, talk a little bit about this and I'll just reinforce it. When you use headings, you're formatting your text in the back end as well, so that a screen reader knows what the headings are. Instead of just bolding something, you're actually tagging it, might be a better word to describe it. So when you use headings, you're adding structure and navigability to your document. So someone that's using a keyboard or a screen reader can also browse your content. This might seem counterintuitive, but H1, heading 1, is actually the biggest heading, and it goes all the way down to heading 6. So you can have 6 levels of headings, which is probably more than enough unless you're doing something really obscure. I showed you a screenshot of Microsoft Word. Use Microsoft Word styles. It's on the same tab or the same panel as your text formatting options. Or your web editor, if you're editing like a website from within the website, it'll also have options to use headings in there as well. All right, so I'm gonna play a short video on how to use Microsoft Styles. So that previous slide again is just where the Styles pane is located. So I'm on the Home tab on Microsoft Word. This is where Microsoft Styles is. And what I'm going to show you is some content. Obviously, it's all just dummy content I've laid out. I'm going to highlight the headings and make sure they're set as headings. And then I'm going to change the formatting. And you'll see that all items that are tagged with the same heading level are also going to change the formatting. So it's a really nice way to be able to change the look of your document very quickly just by using headings. So these are heading 1, heading 2, and this is classified as normal text in my document here. All right, so this video is playing. So you can see I highlight the subheading. I'm changing the font. I've used Times New Roman here. And if you right click on heading 2, you can update heading 2 to match so that now all of the heading 2s are Times New Roman. I'm doing the same thing now for heading 1. I've changed it to a different font. I'm right clicking, updating heading 1 to match this new formatting, and you can see the other one changed as well. And last but not least, I'm going to change the text to kind of a funky looking font that I don't really recommend, but I'm trying to make a visual impact here. And if you update that to match the selection, you can see all the normal fonts changed as well. So this is a really nice feature just for yourself as someone that's writing a document, especially if you have a long document. You can go back after the fact and very quickly change the look of an entire document because you've been tagging things as heading or as normal text from the very beginning. So this can save you a lot of time. This is also a really good strategy if you have students that are having to use like APA headings or MLA headings in a document. They can, at the very start, set up all the headings as styles in Microsoft Word, and then they can just choose the heading level they want to use, and it'll make their life so much easier rather than individually having to format these headings. So there's a lot of, it's only a teeny bit extra front end work. I mean, I love using headings, and it can save you so much time in the long run. Oops, let's play again. Let's move on. All right. So moving on from that, another recommendation I have is to use list formatting. That means use the numbered lists that are available in your document. So 1, 2, and 3, instead of just typing out 1, 2, 3, make sure you have your list, highlight your list, and then use the numbered list option in whatever editor you're using or Microsoft Word. Same thing for unordered lists. This is like my grocery list here. Instead of making a list, we're using something like, dashes or asterisks to appear to be a list. Go ahead and go in and use the bullet list, okay? Again, this makes a really big deal for people using screen readers or using keyboards. They'll be able to scan through your content much more quickly if it's formatted in the back end. Again, it's all about formatting in the back end. And once again, if you use ordered lists and unordered lists in Microsoft Word, for instance, you can always go back and change the look of all of your lists at once after the fact if you want to. It's a nice way to kind of tag things and also be able to change things yourself later on. A few other quick tips for documents: avoid extra blank spaces or lines. Screen readers will actually read those aloud. It'll go space, 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 line, 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 line. Control Enter or Command Enter if you're on a Mac to break to the next page rather than having extra blank spaces in your document. This one, I don't have an example to show you of this because we don't have a whole lot of time, but you need to position images in line and not floating. This can be a little bit tricky to make the document look the way you want it to, but it is the only way to make your document accessible, because if it's floating, then when you're using a screen reader or using a keyboard, the document doesn't really know where the image should fall within the content, so you have to put it on the same line basically as if it were text. Word is really wonderful about having a built-in accessibility checker. It'll check for things like alt text, it'll check for things like extra blank spaces or lines, it'll check for things like whether your images are in line, and it'll give you the ability to quickly go find those things and fix the issue. PowerPoint files could be made accessible, but they're not as good as Word. It's not as easy as Word, it's a lot more difficult. So I really recommend you can actually export PowerPoint to Word, and they can use Word instead to make sure your document is accessible. And I put a little period here at the end on purpose. PDFs are the worst, period. I recommend if you have a document to distribute it as a Word document, because when you convert it to a PDF, a lot of the time the formatting gets messed up and it's no longer accessible. It's just in PDFs, I mean, when you use the PDF editors, they're difficult. It's hard to make things accessible. Word is pretty easy. I recommend just using Word. All right, I think this is lastly flyers and handouts. Let's talk about those really quickly here. In general, I recommend using effective visual design. I have a whole another presentation that I've actually recorded and posted on graphic design if you want to go back and watch that. But in general, declutter. Anything that's not relevant to the message you're trying to send is superfluous. Get rid of it. It's distracting. Use white space. Let your elements breathe. That's totally okay. Don't be afraid of white space. And lay out your content logically. There should be some sort of focal point in your document, in your design. The eye should go there. That should be the most important thing that your user needs to know. And then there should be some sort of hierarchy in your visual design. So the most important thing is the most noticeable, and then the eye can travel to the other things that are less important, but still necessary. And again, good design lets the user find what they need quickly, okay? So a way you can always test out your visual designs is by giving your design to someone else that has no idea what it's about and ask them to tell you really quickly what it's about. Good way to test it out. Let's give you a quick example of a design. This is circa, I don't know, 2003 Yahoo homepage. I don't know how many of you remember this exciting experience. If you wanted to get something done, it took you a little while to figure out where to click, right? I mean, I don't know what Yahoo is trying to be. It's trying to be all things to all people, and there's just a lot going on. There's sort of a focal point, but then everything else is the exact same size of text. It's really hard to figure out what's important, what's not important, how to get things done. So again, in my presentation on graphic design, I talk a lot about contrast and making things stand out. This isn't very good at that. It's hard to get things done. So in contrast to Yahoo, there's our old friend Google. They didn't become a word in the English language for nothing. When you go to Google, you know what can be done and you know how to get it done very quickly. You have basically one option. You type something in the box or not, and that's it. There's no guesswork about how to get it done. And you also see that they have a beautiful use of white space here as well. A lot of Apple ads also have some beautiful white space and good focal points as well. They're all examples of good design. If you want to learn more about that, again, I've got to record a presentation, but I really, really love this book, the Non-Designer's Design Book. It's just what the title says. You don't have to be a designer, and it goes through and gives wonderful examples of 4 principles of good design. I also really, really love the text, Don't Make Me Think. I love it so much, I actually use it as a book in one of the classes that I teach at Cal State Fullerton. Again, it's a fun, quick read with good examples on how to create really usable things. Basically, anything that you create and put on the web, you'll make better if you read this book. All right. Now, if you have some sort of visual design that's inaccessible, my recommendation is to create an accessible alternative using Word, okay? So basically you'll create 2 versions of it, lay out the content in the alternate version using Word in the order it should be read or viewed. It won't look as pretty, but it will be accessible, okay? So sometimes you have something really beautiful, but it's not accessible. Create an equivalent experience and you'll be good to go. All right, so any questions at this point? I'll give you a moment to pop those into the chat box, and then we'll move into how to know if something's accessible. All right, so as we go through, please pop in your comments. We've got 17 minutes left in this webinar. It'll be done by 1 o'clock Pacific. So go ahead and dive into analyzing accessibility, and we can always chat at the end here. All right, so say you're striving to make something accessible and you're not sure if you were successful or not. If you're using something like Word, it has a built-in accessibility checker. But otherwise, if you publish something to the web, a website, or maybe a course page, if you have an online course, you can check accessibility using Wave, okay? Here's the web address for it, wave.webaim.org. It's a really nice evaluation tool where you just pop in a web page address and it'll analyze it for you. If you have something that is behind a password or it's something you have to log in for, you can also get a plugin for Chrome if you use Chrome. And you can have that Wave plugin in your browser and you can click on that instead to run an accessibility check of your web page. I use it for my online courses. When you run Wave, this is a report that it gives you, an example of the report it gives you. It gives you a little summary with your potential errors, alerts, structural elements, so on and so forth. So I'll give you a quick example of how this actually works. I enjoy picking on for-profit universities, so let's take a quick look at University of Phoenix. They have a very full of content homepage that can be a little bit difficult to navigate even if you are using a mouse and you're fully sighted. We'll see if this loads here. Okay, great. See, this page has so much content on it, it actually took a long time to load. All right, so when you load Wave and you run phoenix.edu, you end up with kind of a cluttered screen here. It's kind of hard to see what's going on. You take a look at the report here. It's got the summary. It says it's 14 errors and also 56 alerts. That's the thing I check first. It does have 43 features as well. It has some contrast errors. We talked about contrast. You can probably imagine what those are. It can be hard to see, since it's labeled everything on the screen, it can be really hard to see what the individual issues are. So there is a way to toggle styles on and off. So what this does is it basically takes off all the fancy stuff that makes a website pretty, and it lays it out in linear order as if you're using a keyboard. So if you're ever curious if a website is in the correct order for a keyboard user, you can always put it here, turn off the styles, and you'd see this is the order that someone using a keyboard would go through. So you can see there's a lot here. All right, so let's go into details. So the details are where it lays out the details for all of the items that are listed in the summary. So for example, it says that there's 4 images missing alternative text. So wherever that is, it's missing alternative text. There's some things like missing form labels, unless you're a programmer. I don't really know how to fix those off the top of my head, but generally your web editor or website should be robust enough that it automatically has these programmed in. We got some empty links here. That means if you click on it, you don't really know where it goes. There's contrast errors. Now, if you have styles off, you can't really see what's going on with the contrast errors because, again, all the images have been taken out. So you can turn styles back on and then click on one of these, and it'll take you to where the contrast issue is. Again, it's loading a little bit funkily here. Oh, here's a good example. All right, so the contrast issue here is that this text overlying this photograph has insufficient contrast. And that's pretty clear, right? Even if you're a sighted user with pretty good vision, I can see that, yeah, this is likely a contrast issue just by looking at it. So it can alert you to those issues. We didn't talk about this, but if you have redundant alternate text, that can be a problem because it's reading the same alternate text to the user more than once. I mean, that's a waste of their time, basically. I'll browse through the rest of these really quickly here. I want to point out that the features it lists can also sometimes be issues. So it does tell you if you do have alternate text, it'll take you to the text and show you this one actually does have alternate text. That's a good feature. It doesn't tell you if it's good alternate text, okay? So that's something that you'd have to check out. So I can actually find out right now. If I click on this, it takes me to this icon that does have alternate text. Oh, I don't know why it's scrolling around like that. It's jumping around here. This one is actually, the text is email icon. This thing's going crazy. And that is sufficient for that icon, so that's good. Now it's listed here as a feature. I don't know why this is under features and not under errors. It says that there's empty alternate text. So there might be something like some spaces or something in the tags for these things. Yeah, there's like a space in there, but there's not actually an alternate text, so that's a problem. And then something else I really like to look at is the structure. So it has the structural elements here. It's showing me that I am using heading levels. But I like if you go to structure, it actually shows you the hierarchy of your website. So it's got a bunch of navigation options here, which is fine. And then it shows you H1 is at the top here, then there's H2, then there's H3. And that's great, right? I'm glad that this website's using headers. But what I was really surprised by is as you go down here, it's using like 1,000 H3s. So if someone was going through with a keyboard or a screen reader trying to scan the content, they have to scan through a whole lot of headings to find what they're looking for. So if these are all FAQ, they have to scan through all of those to find the question they're looking for. So this is an example of too much content on one page. It's a bad user experience. It should be broken up into multiple pages. And then actually Wave has a built-in contrast checker. So if you wanted to check the colors and if they're good enough contrast for a website, you can actually enter those colors here and it'll check for you. And you can also kind of just pick a color if you wanted to. You can change the lightness or darkness here and it'll actually tell you the contrast ratio. If you make it too light, you'll see that this text down below will actually change from pass to fail. See those change down below. So that's actually a really good built-in way to find sufficient colors if you want. So you remember that 4.5 to 1, that is the magic line that people, or these items should be enough of a contrast to meet 4.5 to 1. Remember, we're only using level AA. So this is again where I wanted to give the context for WCAG level 2.0 AA. This is a pass for level AA. Level AAA, which is more accessible, this would be a fail. So again, there's different levels of accessibility you have to meet. This one would meet WCAG 2.0 if you use this text. Okay, so that's my quick example of how to use Wave. I'll go ahead and head back over to my PowerPoint here. If you want to practice using Wave yourself or checking accessibility, I do have a practice activity for you on my website. I've got a whole entry on lonepinelearning.com/accessibility. I've got a list of further resources for you to get more information on items that are of interest to you. And I also have a practice activity with kind of a before and after web page where you can try using Wave yourself to analyze the accessibility and then see how well you did. So that brings me right to the end of my presentation. Thank you again to Cal State Fullerton's MS and Certificate in Instructional Design and Technology for sponsoring today's webinar. I'm enjoying doing these webinars over the summer. We have one more next week on copyright. So if you ever wondered if you can use something you found on the web, this presentation is going to be all about that and why it matters. And if you want more information on the Cal State Fullerton MS and Certificate in Instructional Design and Technology, you can check that out online. And again, at the bottom here, I've got my own URL for further resources related to accessibility. So that brings me to the end. If you have questions, please pop those into the chat box. If you'd like to be unmuted, I can unmute you as well. If you got someplace else you'd like to be, please go ahead and get there. And I appreciate you so much taking time out of your observed July 4th holiday to join me for accessibility. And I hope you have a fantastic 4th and a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.